folks, especially so many students, and thanks, of course, to Dr. Glasser for the introduction and for all of your hard work organizing today's event. I am a trained family sociologist, and so most of my research, Dr. Glasser already indicated, has really looked at same-sex marriage and divorce. So I am, of course, a bit biased in this regard, but I would argue that really no social or cultural issue has fueled more public debate or concern in recent US history than the question of whether same-sex couples should have the legal right to marry. And the last decade and a half in particular has really seen kind of a flurry of activism and litigation and legislation all addressing this question. But of course, none was more significant than the 2015 Supreme Court decision Obergefell v. Hodges. Rendered on June 26th of that year, the Obergefell decision legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. And at the time, I was a graduate student living in Syracuse, New York, and I remember the afternoon the announcement was made. I just instinctively jumped up and had to rush to be near other queer folks as soon as I could. So I ran to a nearby community nonprofit where my spouse worked at the time. And found out lots of other queer folks did the same thing. And so we walked together to the steps of a nearby progressive church, and there was a kind of impromptu rally with hundreds of us spending hours sort of talking and celebrating. And I think that really indicates, right, how much this felt like, and indeed was, a very landmark achievement for the LGBTQ+ rights movement. It's important to understand, of course, that at the time of the Obergefell decision, 36 states plus Washington, D.C. already recognized same-sex marriages. And so most same-sex couples across the US already had legal access to marriage. But the Obergefell decision extended that right to all same-sex couples, but also, critically importantly, it made sure that all states had to recognize all same-sex marriages, which prior to the Obergefell decision wasn't the case, right? So even couples who were legally married did not have the right to travel to other states and know that the rights that come with their marriage would be recognized. And if that sounds trivial, imagine a not particularly hypothetical scenario, right? Where a married same-sex couple from, say, New York traveled to Texas, something bad happens, an accident, one of them has to be hospitalized. Despite being married, they wouldn't have had the right in that state to hospital visitation, right? And so that was a very significant achievement. More recently, the question has emerged, is Obergefell indeed safe? As many of you likely recall, last summer, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health Organization, and in that decision overturned Roe v. Wade and thus the constitutional right to abortion services. In his majority opinion on that decision, Justice Clarence Thomas indicated that he believes, in the passage I've highlighted here, that Obergefell, along with other really important Supreme Court decisions, ought to be reconsidered. So keep in mind, the Chief Justice, John Roberts, along with Samuel Alito, quite the conservative justice, have both made very clear and said publicly they do not believe Obergefell should be reconsidered. They've gone so far as to say if it is, they don't know they would even be supportive of it. But even so, you can imagine how much anxiety and concern this has fueled within the LGBTQ+ community, and in part because 35 states still have on the books laws and or constitutional amendments that would ban same-sex marriage. And so if it turns out that in the future Obergefell is overturned, those bans would likely become active again. And so given this concern, we have seen, perhaps not surprisingly, a really sharp increase recently in the number of same-sex couples filing for marriage licenses, especially in the South. For example, one county in North Carolina, Buncombe County, has seen since July of 2022 a threefold increase in the number of same-sex couples seeking marriage licenses. And a lot of this has been fueled by events like this one. It's a beautiful event I just wanted to profile very quickly. It took place in July of 2022 in New Orleans. It was called Can't Stop Love, and it was a kind of event, lots of similar events like it took place across the country, where community volunteers, right, made themselves available to same-sex couples to offer their help in filing for marriage licenses, which is surprisingly complicated, time-consuming, and costly process. My favorite part of this event, aside from, of course, the beautiful and selfless spirit of volunteerism we see here, is the sign in pink, which you probably can't read, but it says, "The only thing that needs to be straight is your paperwork." Now, you may be wondering, right, because you may have heard, right, as recently as December, we saw some legislation on this front meant to alleviate some of these concerns. In December, President Joe Biden signed the Respect for Marriage Act. This act was sold as a kind of protection for same-sex and interracial marriages. And the bill passed the Senate by a 61-36 vote, including support from 12 Republican senators. So that bipartisan support, no doubt a symbolic victory, but the Respect for Marriage Act has significant limitations I think it's important to be aware of. To be clear, the Respect for Marriage Act does not require states to recognize same-sex marriages. It also doesn't require states to recognize interracial marriages. All it requires, and this was the condition that those 12 Republican senators insisted on, the only thing it requires is that all states recognize any marriage legally contracted in any other state. So under Obergefell, yes, that means by default, right? that it covers or includes same-sex marriages. But if the Obergefell decision is ever overturned, and given recent history, there's reason to suspect the Supreme Court might issue deeply unpopular opinions, then the Respect for Marriage Act would literally do nothing to protect those marriages, right? So I think it's worth asking a set of questions, right? How did we get to this point? And how did all of these legal changes come about? Given how deeply unpopular the idea of same-sex marriage was in the very recent past, what arguments were made by activists and others to convince the general public and eventually policymakers to support such changes? And of course, what about LGBTQ plus people themselves, right? Beyond activists, how have their intimate lives been impacted by these entanglements with such policy debates and legal changes? So in my talk today, I just want to try to address these sorts of questions, and I really have three primary objectives, okay? First, I just want to narrate the history of marriage equality as best I can as a goal for the broader LGBTQ plus movement. And in particular, I want to draw some attention to how marriage equality became a goal for that movement despite early opposition from so many activists. Second, I want to very briefly describe the evolution of public opinion on marriage equality, and I want to draw particular attention to just how quickly public opinion shifted on this issue and the role that interpersonal contact or coming out played in that process. And then third, I want to summarize some of the social science research that's been conducted thus far on sexual minority marriages. And since I'm a sociologist who studies these things, I'm going to draw to the extent that I can on some of my own research. But in particular, I want to address A, sexual minority marriage rates, B, marital aspirations among sexual minority young adults, and C, the psychological and relational benefits of marriage for sexual minorities. Okay. So starting with this first point or objective about the history of marriage equality as a goal for the LGBTQ plus movement, I think it's important to understand, as I've indicated already, right, that marriage equality has not always been a goal of this movement. And in fact, to the extent that early activists took up the question of marriage equality at all, they were uniformly opposed to it, right? So for example, one really good and famous illustration of this comes from Carl Whitman, who was a famous gay activist in the 1960s and 70s. And he wrote in the Gay Manifesto, "Traditional marriage is a rotten, oppressive institution. Marriage is a contract which smothers both people, denies needs, and places impossible demands on both people. Gay people must stop gauging their self-respect by how well they mimic straight marriages to find that happiness comes through finding a groovy spouse," remember, published in the 1970s, "and settling down, showing the world that we're just the same as you, is avoiding the real issues and is an expression of self-hatred," right? So there's two kind of parallel arguments going on here, right? One is that the desire to seek marriage is itself a kind of act of assimilation, right? Getting married would be assimilating into a kind of heteronormative institution. But even further, the argument goes that that desire likely reflects some kind of internalized hatred or homophobia, right? A lack of acceptance of oneself as a queer person. And so we saw this argument made by all kinds of activists, right? And here is one of, I think, the most interesting. If you aren't familiar, the activist holding up the sign here is Harry Hay. Harry Hay was an avowed Marxist who helped found the Mattachine Society in the 1950s. The Mattachine Society was regarded as one of the first political organizations in the country to advocate on behalf of LGBTQ plus people. And he was eventually a key player in the radical fairy movement. Fascinating. I'm happy to talk about it if anybody's got questions. He also expressed some support for NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. So no doubt he had some controversial views, right? But his critique of marriage was widely shared. And so the way he put it here, and I have to confess a kind of love for the playful spirit of the sign, he said, take off your hetero-imitative frog skin and dance to a lesbian gay spirit, right? The first same-sex couple in the US to ever file for a marriage license was this couple, Michael McConnell and Jack Baker, and they did so here in Minnesota, actually. Neither are from Minnesota, but they moved here so that McConnell could take a job as a librarian at the University of Minnesota. After coming out, he was promptly fired from that job, but before leaving the state, he and Baker applied for a marriage license with Ramsey County, and that was immediately denied. And later that year, the Minnesota Supreme Court actually affirmed the county clerk's decision. But before that happened, right, McConnell and Baker applied for another marriage license, this time in Blue Earth County. And in fact, Blue Earth County issued that marriage license, which means, in a bit of, I think, underappreciated local history, Blue Earth County was literally the first county in the history of the United States to issue a marriage license to same-sex couples. I think we should like put that on a billboard, right? Like so that people can see it as they're coming into town. That's just me, right? The point here, right, is that McConnell and Baker, in doing so in 1971, right, like 1 year after Whitman published the Gay Manifesto, were applying for a marriage license against the grain of the broader LGBTQ plus movement and without any support whatsoever from that movement. Really, within the LGBTQ plus movement, marriage equality doesn't become even a widely debated issue until the late 1980s with the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, which, if you know your queer history, is kind of a monumental moment, right? And in this moment, right, organizers of the event included a small upstart group called Couples Inc. And Couples Inc. Wanted to hold an event, and did hold an event that eventually became called The Wedding. And it was, as part of this march, a like public performance of like mock weddings, and it took place on the steps of the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. And the goal was to do it there to kind of make visible the unfair tax burdens that same-sex couples had to endure absent equal marriage rights. But this wasn't popular within the LGBTQ plus movement, right? It was a point of debate, to be sure. And it wasn't really until after the National March on Washington that eventually the LGBTQ plus movement took up the issue of marriage equality. And if you're wondering why, and why at this particular moment in history, the historian George Chauncey gives us two really compelling answers. He says, one, remember, this was the height of the AIDS epidemic, right? This was a point in time at which gay men in particular were being ravaged by an untreated disease. And so suddenly in that context, the importance of things like hospital visitation became really clear, right? Similarly, this is also the point at which we saw what, in retrospect, social scientists have called the lesbian baby boom, right? This was the first point, really, in which we saw lots of lesbian couples having babies themselves, having children themselves within the relationship, rather than bringing those kids into a same-sex relationship from a prior heterosexual relationship, right? And so that too put a spotlight on the importance of things like parental rights. And both of those together, according to Chauncey, really created kind of this pent-up demand for marriage equality among LGBTQ plus people, many of whom, again, previously had no interest whatsoever in the question of marriage. Now, so far, we've really talked about the LGBTQ plus movement, right? Marriage equality doesn't become a national issue. It doesn't become like central to national politics, or it doesn't become the kind of like kitchen table issue that it was for so long until 1993. And it's that year specifically because that was the year of Bayer versus Lewin. Bayer versus Lewin was a decision issued by the Hawaii Supreme Court. And it was filed originally by 3 same-sex couples in Hawaii who applied for marriage licenses, but were denied those licenses. And in that case, the Hawaii Supreme Court actually sided with those same-sex couples and said, indeed, they have a constitutional right to marriage. the Hawaii Supreme Court made two arguments here, right? One was they drew a parallel between same-sex marriage and interracial marriage. And they cited the Supreme Court's 1967 decision in Loving versus Virginia and said, on those same grounds, same-sex couples have a right to marry. They also, and I'm just pointing this out because it became really important later on, they also pointed to the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, which basically says that all states have to recognize contracts issued in other states, right? Marriages are contracts. And so they said denying same-sex couples this right would be a violation of the full faith and credit clause. And they basically said all states have to do the same. As you can imagine, within the context of 1993, where same-sex marriage was deeply unpopular, this set off a kind of national firestorm. And conservative activists who up to that point had mostly dismissed the issue of marriage equality because it was so unpopular, suddenly jumped into action, right? And suddenly threw innumerable resources at the cause. And so because of that, in 1996, we get the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA. And this is the legislation signed by Democratic President Bill Clinton that officially defined in federal law marriage as, quote, a relationship between one man and one woman. Okay. Now, it's really in this like post-1996 period that marriage equality is, again, a kind of like major issue that people are talking about and debating at the kitchen table across the country. And so it's really in this context that a lot of major arguments, both for and against same-sex marriage, coalesced and became common knowledge. And so I want to try to summarize as quickly as I can some of those arguments. And I want to start with support for same-sex marriage. Activists here advanced a kind of liberal rights-based argument, right? And they pointed to the fact that in the US, there are, to be exact, 1,049 specific rights that are attached to marriage that literally you cannot access without getting married, right? And the argument went, if that's the case, right, then same-sex couples who are denied the right to marry are effectively denied those rights and are thus rendered second-class citizens. And some of these rights, to be clear, very trivial. For instance, one of them is that only after getting married can you, upon dying, transfer your federal fishing license to your spouse, right? Not a particularly important right, perhaps, but again, some of those 1,049 rights included things like hospital visitation rights, parental rights, insurance and taxation benefits. And so there was quite a lot at stake here in the question of whether indeed LGBTQ people were second-class citizens. Now, I also want to emphasize, though, that even in this context, even post-1996, a lot of the sort of critique or skepticism toward marriage that we saw with earlier LGBTQ plus activists hangs around, right? And it gets articulated into different ways, but I think you'll see some real similarities here. So for example, it was commonly said, still is commonly said by many, that marriage and the cause of marriage equality is, quote, homonormative, right? And most of you are probably familiar already with the concept of heteronormativity, right? The idea that like all people are by default heterosexual and the ways that that assumption is kind of built or baked into social arrangements. With homonormativity, it's something a bit different. And the concept comes to us from the scholar Lisa Dugan, and she defines it this way. Homonormativity is, quote, a politics that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions, but upholds and sustains them, while promising the possibility of a demobilized gay constituency and a privatized, depoliticized gay culture anchored in domesticity and consumption. So there's a lot going on here, but her critique, importantly, goes beyond that earlier critique of marriage equality as assimilationist, right? Certainly, that's part of the argument here, but she goes further in saying that same-sex couples and those advocating for marriage equality were complicit, or at least could be complicit, in reproducing problematic aspects of heteronormative institutions like marriage. Here's a really good example of this critique. This image was developed by a radical collective called Queer Action Figures. And in it, you can see it points out, as does Dugan, the idea that marriage equality is assimilationist. At the top, the phrase, "we're just like you," speaks to that, right? But even further, right, it points to the ways that Being just like you might also be sexist, racist, and classist. So why is that? It's important to understand, right, that over the last several decades in the US, marriage as an institution has become whiter and whiter, right? In other words, the people who are most likely to marry now are those with the greatest advantages or privileges in society. And in particular, we see that white folks are much more likely, statistically speaking, than those from marginalized racial groups to marry, right? So if there are all sorts of benefits, right, legal rights and other kinds of benefits, I will certainly say a lot about in just a moment, if some of those are attached to marriage, and we know that there are racial discrepancies in marriage, right, that means, according to queer activists critiquing marriage, that the politics of marriage equality doesn't really do anything to disrupt or even challenge, right, that kind of arrangement. And all it does instead is say, let us in, right? Let us same-sex couples participate, right? And so, building on this, organizations like a San Francisco-based organization named Gay Shame, they wrote, building on some of those earlier critiques that we saw from Carl Whitman and others, that marriage, rather than including same-sex couples, should again be abolished. Gay Shame wrote, what we are calling for is an abolishment of state-sanctioned coupling in either the hetero or homo incarnation. We are against any institution that perpetuates the further exploitation of some people for the benefit of others. Why do the fundamental necessities marriage may provide for some, like healthcare, have to be wedded to the state-sanctioned ritual of terror known as marriage? Now that might seem pretty radical, and calling for the disentangling of these sorts of rights from marriage, especially from an American perspective, probably seems a bit radical. But keep in mind, lots of countries around the world have experimented with various kinds of arrangements to deal with exactly this issue. Just one very famous example. In France, individuals can petition the government for what are called civil solidarity pacts, right? Civil solidarity pacts give those who are granted them most of the same rights that come with marriage. Not all, but most. And here's the key part of it. You don't have to be a couple to enter into a civil solidarity pact. If you want to build a life with a best friend, you can, and the French government will offer rights to accompany that. A roommate, just the same. So again, this might seem a bit radical in the American context. This is expressing common sense articulated in lots of places around the world, for better or worse. Okay, I want to transition and talk a bit about public opinion, okay? Now, clearly, as you can imagine, and as the data we'll talk about will show, these kinds of radical queer critiques of marriage didn't convince the wider public very much, right? So, in fact, if you look at the period here between 1996, and remember, that's when the Defense of Marriage Act was passed, and 2015, and that's when the Obergefell decision was rendered, you see an enormous increase, right, in approval of same-sex marriage. In fact, between those time periods, the support increased from 27% to 60%. And so what that means is, in 2015, or actually fast forward, now approval is over 70%, right? So what that means is, sorry, I'm getting a phone call. What that means is that right now, today, it is almost as popular, statistically speaking, to oppose marriage equality as it was to support it in the early 1990s, right? So I think that really speaks volumes about just how dramatically public opinion on this issue has changed, and in a relatively short period of time. Furthermore, there is no doubt, of course, that there are lots of factors that still predict support for marriage equality, and also, no doubt, some groups still much more likely to support marriage equality than others. But even among groups that are the least likely to support marriage equality, think, for instance, older adults, those who are more religious, those who identify as Republicans, even those groups have seen dramatic increases in their support for marriage equality, such that today, over 50% of Republicans, a statistical majority of Republican voters, say they support marriage equality. That's worth noting, in part because the last official platform passed by the Republican Party actually holds as a position for that party opposition to marriage equality. So even though most voters support it, the party itself doesn't. But I really want to emphasize the dramatic nature of this change, okay? Attitudes toward same-sex marriage, according to public opinion experts, have changed literally more quickly than any other issue in the history of public opinion polling. And just to give you some context for this, right? On average, when opinions, even about the most controversial issue change, they change, again, on average, about 1% in any direction, in either direction in any given year. Marriage equality, right, support for marriage equality consistently grew and at a rate of almost 2% per year, right? So literally almost double the average. And again, that's historically unprecedented. Lots of factors driving this, no doubt about it. But interestingly, Michael Rosenfeld, who's a sociologist, he points to one factor we might not think about very much, which is coming out, right? Coming out, of course, queer folks have been coming out for as long as that's been a thing. But really, we started to see huge increases in the number of queer folks who say they're out and the number of folks who say they know someone who identifies as queer post-1992, right? So really an overlap with the kind of period in which we're seeing this huge increase in support. And Rosenfeld's calculated that knowing someone who identifies as gay or lesbian specifically increases on average support for marriage equality by about 16%, right? That's pretty big, right? And so this gets to questions about what social scientists call the contact hypothesis. And I have lots I could say about that in the Q&A if anyone's interested. But I just want us to understand, right, how dramatically this has just changed and how quickly. Now, today, there are approximately 4%, it's approximately 4% of the adult population of the US that identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, or in some way as non-heterosexual. That number might seem a bit low. When I teach these figures in classes, students are often surprised, and usually what they guess is that the figure is closer to 10%. That number of 10%, if you've heard it, has anyone heard that figure? 10% of the population is LGBTQ+. Yeah, it's a pretty common figure. That figure actually goes back to Alfred Kinsey. If you know Alfred Kinsey, he was a sort of pioneering sex researcher in the 1940s and 50s, and he literally traveled around the country just asking people these really probing questions about their sexual behavior. And he discovered that about 10% of the population had reported having at least one same-sex sexual encounter in their lifetime. And so on that basis, right, he concluded 10% of the population is lesbian or gay. Two problems with that. One, just to put it briefly and frankly, his sampling was sketchy. Two, behavior isn't the same as identity, right? And it's entirely possible for a person to have a same-sex encounter and not identify as lesbian, gay, queer, or anything else, right? In fact, same-sex encounters are statistically fairly common among heterosexually identified people, especially women. So that's not a very reliable measure. The more accurate number is about 4%, despite popular mythology. If we zero in on that 4%, about 21% are currently married. Two important points though. One, most are actually married to a different sex spouse, not a same-sex spouse. That's because estimates vary, but somewhere between 40 and 50% of the non-heterosexual population in the US is bisexual, right? The other key thing here that I want to emphasize, that figure of 21% is well below the figure of about 50% for the general adult population of the US. So what that means is, even all these years after the Obergefell decision, it's still the case that LGBTQ plus adults are less likely to marry than those from the general population. Also, there are about, according to US Census data, a little under 1 million same-sex couples in the US, and we know that about 58% of them are married. So doing the math, that means that there are just a little over 500,000 currently married same-sex couples in the US today. But I want to dive into these numbers just a bit more deeply, and I promise not to spend too much time here with these tables, but there are significant or noteworthy racial and educational patterns here. Remember I said a moment ago, right, that we have in the US enormous racial discrepancies in marriage, right? On average, people from marginalized racial groups are less likely to marry than those who are white, right? And that pattern holds among married LGBTQ plus people. But the pattern is a bit different, right? And what we know from these numbers is that on average, the married LGBTQ plus population is less white and more racially diverse than the married heterosexual population. So at the top here, we can see, right, if you look at married heterosexual people in the US, about 83% are currently married. That figure is about 75% for married LGBTQ people. Also, right, looking specifically at the married LGBTQ plus population, we see greater representation for those who are Latinx, Black, or Asian than we do see among the married heterosexual population. So again, those patterns still hold, but they're not as strong, right, among married LGBTQ plus people. Similarly, right, there's a pattern like this in terms of education. For decades, scholars have been lamenting, and conservative activists have been particularly concerned about the fact that on average, those with the highest levels of education are the most likely to marry, and among those with the lowest levels of education, there's been what's often called a retreat from marriage. When we compare side by side the married LGBTQ plus population to the married heterosexual population, some differences emerge. At the same time, the married LGBTQ plus population is both more and less educated. Here's how, right? If you look at the top row, these are folks who have graduate degrees. Here, LGBTQ plus people are more likely to be higher educated, right, at this level. But here, when we look at those who just have a college degree or some college experience, right, here it's the heterosexual population that's better represented. And then here at the bottom, when we look at those with the lowest levels of education, it's again the LGBTQ plus population that's better represented. So in other words, that pattern that has been documented and discussed and debated about marriage and education for decades, it's a little bit more complicated when we zero in on married LGBTQ plus people specifically, okay? Now, this is all about people who are married, but what about marital aspirations or the desire to marry? There isn't a lot of data here, and so in 2021, I designed a survey. I administered it online via Qualtrics with the help of lots of graduate students. And by the way, there's still a lot that can be done with this data. So if any of you want to do some research, let me know. I would be happy to collaborate with you. And that includes students, especially students. But we can see from this data, right, about 60% of those in my sample, it's a relatively small, convenient sample of 257, but from those individuals, about 60% say that they would like to get married someday. Only 4% strongly disagree with the statement, I want to get married someday. So a majority want to marry. Keep in mind, in general population surveys of young adults, again, usually defined as those between 18 and 35, those figures typically are somewhere between 69 and 75%. Clearly, we would have to make any comparisons with a lot of caution, given the limitations of my data. But I think we can conclude that it certainly seems like most want to marry, but perhaps maybe fewer, right? It raises that question. And so I also asked, as part of the survey, some open-ended qualitative questions about why people may or may not want to get married. And the two dominant answers I got from those who said that they do want to marry, again, these are all unmarried LGBTQ plus young adults, were companionship and commitment, right? And so with companionship, really what respondents were looking for was someone to spend time with, right? Someone to journey through life with, and someone to be there for them through life's ups and downs. And so, for example, one survey respondent wrote, I would like to get married someday because I think it would be nice to have a life partner, like love romantically and as a person, someone to share life with, have fun, travel, support each other, maybe have children if desired and able. The second reason, commitment, here people really just wanted someone that they know would be with them through life, someone that they could always count on to support them even when it matters most, even when life is hardest. And so one respondent wrote, I want to engage in a lifelong commitment with my partner. Although I recognize that marriage is not the only way to do that, for me personally, it is an important symbol of our commitment to one another. Now, among those who do marry, right, there's a growing body of evidence that makes very, very clear getting married is significantly beneficial for both LGBTQ plus individuals and their relationships. So as you can see on the left-hand side here, a lot of evidence points to significant benefits in terms of mental health, right? We know that both people who get married and LGBTQ people who are suddenly given the right to marry, they experience greater perceived social inclusion, right? Meaning they feel more like a part of the society they live in. As part of that, they report less perceived discrimination, meaning in their day-to-day lives, they feel less like they're being discriminated against. They also report lower levels of internalized homophobia, meaning they have greater acceptance of their identity as a sexual minority. And not surprisingly, right, most report fewer depressive symptoms and greater subjective well-being. But I just want to emphasize, right, this is true certainly for those who marry. The effects are strongest for those who marry. But all of these studies also make clear that these benefits extend to LGBTQ people who have the right to marry, not simply getting married. Simply having that right and being pulled out of what felt like second-class citizenship is itself a significant benefit to individual well-being, right? That's individuals. On the couple level, we can see lots of benefits here too. These are, of course, particular to those who do marry. But among those who marry, we see, first of all, stronger perceived commitment to the relationship. This is even from long-term same-sex couples who didn't expect to have any difference in their relationship after getting married. They tend to say in qualitative studies, now that I'm married, I feel more committed to this relationship than ever, right? In turn, it leads to reduced conflict, right? So they have fewer fights or disagreements with their partner and improved relationship stability. This pattern holds consistently. We know with both same-sex and different sex relationships that marriages are always less likely to break up even than cohabiting relationships. That certainly holds true among same-sex couples as well. So I also wanted to point to some benefits beyond the individual and beyond the couple relationship. And I want to point to some benefits in terms of broader family relationships, because this comes to me from some of the qualitative research I've done from a set of interviews I did with 30 currently married gay men and lesbians. I heard a lot of stories, right, about weakened family relationships. And that wasn't particularly surprising. Research has shown for decades now that LGBTQ plus folks tend to have, on average, weaker family relationships, given the kind of hostility they so often encounter in those settings. But I also heard from these interview participants lots of stories about how getting married really changed those family relationships, right? So one example came from a woman I interviewed who said, my dad really struggled when I came out. I think, you know, he had this vision that I would end up marrying a man, so he was pretty slow to come around, but us getting married really helped him. It helped him a lot, actually. He really came around once we started planning the wedding, because he could see how happy I was. And it meant the world to me when he came around. I'm really close with my family, so when my dad came out of that shell, it meant a lot to me. It made everything with my family finally feel right. And aside from parents, that's certainly what I heard the most about. This is true with broader family units as well. A man that I interviewed talked about how he'd really been kind of cast out of his family, and it was only after getting married and his family seeing that through marriage they'd kind of stabilized a relationship and of course legitimized a relationship as normal, right? It was only through that he became suddenly more integrated into his family, and he grew closer with his nieces and nephews. And he said, they've been great ever since, meaning since getting married. They've been very supportive. I feel like we've created a whole new family. I mean, I guess that some people would call their family their best friends. I'm one of them now. Some of the kids in the family call me uncle now, which they never did before. That's really cool. That means a lot to me. And so, okay, I'm going to stop here, somewhat abruptly, I know, but I'm going to stop here so we have plenty of time for questions and answers, but I'll just end by saying that one of the things I hope all of this research makes very clear is what's really at stake, right, in the question of whether Obergefell is safe or whether in time marriage equality might be overturned. What's at stake really are rights and intimate relationships that we know meaningfully transform LGBTQ plus people's lives for the better. And again, research makes clear that having the right to marry and getting married both improve LGBTQ people's mental health in multiple ways, and it strengthens their couple relationships as well as their relationships with family members. So given all of this, I think it's safe to say that any challenge to legal marriage equality is in effect a challenge to the health and well-being of LGBTQ plus people. Thanks.
All right, so if anyone has questions, I'm going to let Dr. Hoy field his own Q&A from the audience, and I'm going to be moderating Zoom. Okay. So anyone on Zoom, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and I can unmute you and you can ask it and we'll hear it, or you can just type it in the Q&A or the chat and I can read it. So we'll open it up. There's about 15 minutes left for question and answer. Anyone has any questions for Dr. Hoy?
questions do you all have? Yeah. Hey.
Thank you so much for the great talk.
Yeah.
I have a question about the trend you were noting both in sort of queer critiques of marriage and then also maybe in some of the support comments from queer people in marriage, the idea that marriage as an institution is powerful enough that it will essentially reshape the relationships and the idea of queerness of the people who go into the institution, right? I wonder if either in your research or in the research of others, now that we've had close to a decade after Obergefell, and of course, longer time after state sanctioned,
Sure.
individual states, if you feel that research has shown that the inclusion of queer people in marriage has changed the institution, either in how people see it, the norms of it, how it's sort of perceived in a temporary moment.
That's a really good and big question. And my oh yeah, of course. Oh yeah, of course. Sorry. There we go. Is that better?
Yeah, now I can see it.
Okay. My instinct is to say that my read of the research is actually probably, it goes the other way, that the institution of marriage has done more to transform queer relationships than queer relationships have done to transform that institution. And it's precisely because of that kind of powerful effect of marriage, right? We often say, I hear this a lot. I even heard this from married folks I've interviewed who've said that prior to marriage, they thought marriage was, raise your hand if you've heard this phrase, just a piece of paper, right? It's nothing different than your previous relationship. It's just suddenly now the state recognizes it. And that's just not true, right? Marriage is a powerful institution, for better or worse, no pun intended, because marriage is a constellation of norms, right? And what we often see is that after getting married, same-sex couples, and it's maybe important to understand as some context, right? Same-sex couples are not just like different sex couples in all sorts of ways, right? Same-sex couples are, for instance, much more likely, especially male same-sex couples, to include consensual non-monogamy, right? Same-sex couples are much more likely to have an equitable distribution of household labor, right? What we've seen is that following marriage, a lot of same-sex couples end up reporting that suddenly now they feel pressured, right, to act in ways and to arrange their relationship in ways that are, frankly, more heteronormative, right? Suddenly it feels like, for instance, consensual non-monogamy is a threat to something bigger or greater, right? And because it's so out of sync with how marriage is typically defined, right? Monogamy is more or less like compulsory within marriage. That pressure sort of has the effect of pushing out or crowding out some of that like queer experimentation with relationships. I don't think it's entirely gone, right? To be sure, I don't want to push it that far. And I suspect that actually this first cohort of married same-sex couples are probably going to be the most experimental, right? And most like non-marital same-sex relationships. But I think going forward, I think we're probably going to see a lot of ways in which really same-sex relationships start looking a bit more like different sex relationships in sort of their day-to-day dynamics. That's kind of my take, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a question. I'm just interested in how and where divorce comes in, either in rates, but really I'm interested in if that came up in your interviews or your surveys with how people talked about motivations for or against marriage.
You mean like?
It's not a specific question. I just, where does divorce come up in any of this in the way you think about this or the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so tell me if this answers the question. Part of my research has looked at same-sex divorce, interviewed really only about 10 folks who've ended a same-sex marriage. As you can imagine, that sampling is challenging right now. And we know that the rate of divorce is approximately the same, right, for same-sex relationships as it is for different sex relationships. It's tough. Those are all necessarily estimates because as with all divorce rates, right, like not all states participate in the program, so we have to kind of fill in some gaps, and where we have data, it suggests they're more or less the same in terms of that rate of divorce. But I would say, and again, tell me if this is answering the question, from the interviews I've done, same-sex divorce is also not like different sex divorce, in that most people still have, including service providers, even people who like work with married or divorcing populations, still have in mind a very heteronormative conception of what marriage and divorce are. So for instance, a number of people that I've interviewed who've ended a same-sex marriage have said, right, I sought out a legal counsel and I was told by multiple lawyers they couldn't represent me in my divorce proceedings because it's a same-sex divorce. Legally, no different, right? But in their mind, it's a very different kind of relationship. And so they run up against this kind of heteronormativity at precisely the moment, right? Imagine ending a marriage, right? This is a point in a person's life at which they often need extensive support, right? It's a moment of significant transition. Families too are similarly not as supportive. And some of the people that I've interviewed have said that their perception is families less supportive because ending a same-sex marriage somehow feels more damning than ending a different sex marriage, right? Different sex marriages have been ending for a very long time now and at a relatively high rate. But relatively new marriages, same-sex marriages, are often sort of like, when they end, understood as like failure, right? In a way that different sex marriages ending just aren't, right? Because they didn't have to fight so hard and for so long to get that right. And so when it ends, it often feels like failure, or it's perceived in that way. So rates are similar, but I would say given all sorts of ongoing heteronormativity, right, it's the experience is a bit different. Does that at all address the question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
If Obergefell does end up getting overturned by the Supreme Court, do you see that having like any sort of impact on like long-term public opinion support for same-sex marriage or same-sex marriage in general?
That's a really good question. I don't think so. If anything, I might guess that at least temporarily, that might boost support for same-sex marriage, right? So we saw, for instance, with the Dobbs decision, right? And the right to an abortion is, of course, a controversial social issue, but as long as we've been tracking public opinion, it's like opposition to the right to abortion has never been a majority opinion, right? About 60% of the US says abortion should be legal in at least some circumstances. That's been true going back to like Roe, with little exceptions in the early 90s. Around like the Casey decision and such. Anyway, point is, right, following the Dobbs decision, some polling showed that instantly people were more approving, right, of abortion rights. And so you might imagine that anything perceived as like an attack on an already established right might generate some sympathy. And so I might guess, I'm just totally speculating out loud here, but I might guess that if there was that kind of a decision at the Supreme Court, that we might get a kind of flurry of energy and support at first. Long term, how that plays out, is a harder question to answer. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, sorry, I know it's not a great answer. Yeah, I know you had your hand up too, Pedro.
In your research or in the interviews you've conducted with folks, have you come across anything to do with, okay, the door was open, we were able to marry and partake and enjoy all the benefits, and was there any expression of sort of a buyer's remorse, kind of consistent with, you know, that notion that there was a lot of critique of the heteronormative and the institution of marriage as traditionally defined. And I remember, I can't remember where I came across it. I think it might have just been in sort of a casual interpersonal interaction with somebody. Somebody quirked me. My gosh, why do they want this? I mean, you know, I remember the old statistic that half of all marriages end in divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And so what really are we getting into here? And I'm especially curious about, you know, talking about largely a stigmatized group of people.
Sure.
And they walked into a normative institution, major normative institution in society. Has that done anything to them about having come out, about the public sphere? Has this sort of legitimized our lifestyle, our sexual preference?
Yeah.
Or has there been sort of a flow?
Yeah, I
They
would.
let us in the door, and now it seems that they're coming down even harder on us.
Yeah, yeah.
than before.
I would say it's both and, if that makes sense. I would say there is, to the first question about like any kind of buyer's remorse. The reason I brought this up, notice, right, the front page of the New York Times, right? Of course, the lead story celebrating the Obergefell decision, but right below it, historic day for gay rights, but a twinge of loss for gay culture, right? I think right on the day of Obergefell, it was widely understood because queer activists and queer folks had been saying for a long time, right, that marriage is this thing straight people do, right? And moreover, that being excluded from that institution for as long as was the case actually kind of created the conditions in which we could really experiment with all different kinds of relationship forms and practices, right? We didn't have to buy into compulsory monogamy, right? And so we could revel in like bathhouses and that sort of thing for as long as we wanted, right? The loss of that was, to a lot of folks, right, unfortunate, right? It meant a kind of normalization. And to the extent that they wanted to resist that, absolutely, some buyer's remorse. But I say it was a both and, because I also think it's true that we have seen, especially for those who do marry, a kind of normalization, right? It speaks to the power of marriage we were talking about a moment ago, right? That getting married for different sex couples, but especially for same-sex couples, within the context of like so much stigma, right? The way it normalizes those relationships and makes them suddenly seem real, committed, valid, serious, can be a meaningful transformation for sure. And so, yeah, we see more people coming out, and we see, for instance, you know, a lot of people say that marriage was for them the catalyst to coming out in contexts where previously they weren't out. So for instance, I've heard lots of stories of people I've interviewed who said, I wasn't out at work, but I got married, and the day I returned to work, I took a picture of my spouse and put it right on my desk. And I felt comfortable doing so because I knew my relationship legally is just like yours, and you can't say anything about it, right? But that kind of normalization is maybe most particular to not only those who participate in the institution, but kind of feel compelled to do so, right? And don't feel such a kind of critical queer distance from marriage. Yeah. And this, by the way, I want to say one more thing. This, by the way, was one of the major queer concerns that we didn't address here, right? A lot of queer scholars and activists were really concerned about not like the normalization of all same-sex relationships, but a kind of status hierarchy or status inequality within LGBTQ plus communities, because suddenly some relationships might be legitimate, right? And others might not, right? And that kind of inequality within the broader community was, I think, part of what we're seeing. I think queer folks have very significant reason to be concerned about that. And so far, I think they're quite right. Yeah.
You have 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
My question kind of changed, and it may be one that your research hasn't addressed yet.
Yeah.
I'm in political science, and I teach public opinion polling in lots of American politics.
Okay.
Fred Slocum.
Yeah.
The primary opposition to marriage equality has been the religious right in U.S. politics and the Christian right. And have they modified or changed their arguments either in light of Obergefell or in light of the crossing of public opinion, which took place between 2010 and 2012 on same-sex marriage? By the crossing, that is the attainment of majority status of those who favor legalized same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
Has the religious right modified their arguments at all in light of any of either of these developments?
Yeah, no, not that I've seen, right? And we didn't really talk about it much, but
Right.
sort of in short, right? Here's kind of a dominant argument that got made by the religious right. Marriage is a kind of bedrock institution for society, right? The argument goes, this is the institution on which civil society rests, right? And that's because marriage is the context within which different sex couples have and raise kids who are like a future generation, right? And so from what I've seen, and I will admit to not being particularly plugged into those networks, but from what I have seen, yeah, that's kind of still the argument. And I'm seeing that argument, I think, partly because as a family sociologist, what I am exposed to are similar kind of arguments made about, hey, there's a retreat from marriage going on among different sex couples, right? And we need to remind them marriage is the foundational institution to try to build back more support for marriage among different sex couples. And so, yeah, I haven't seen much modification there, but that doesn't mean it hasn't changed, right? Just means I haven't seen it. Yeah.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Hoy,
Yeah, of
and
course.
that will conclude our program for today. You might hang out for a few minutes.
Yeah, sure, happy to stick around. Yeah,
All right, well, thank you.
thank you. Is it okay if I leave the?
Yeah, thank you to everyone on Zoom who came.